I only needed shelter, but that old mask was hiding part of my family.
No coat, no room, no wages, just a canvas tool roll and $8 she had hidden beneath the cardboard sole of her left shoe. And with that $8, she bought a forgotten fencing mask maker's loft in Orleans Parish, Louisiana, a place that had fallen from county maps in 1974. The rear roof had opened above the rafters. Green corrosion had eaten through the iron balcony. The parish condemned it on October 18, 1996, and scheduled demolition for the coming spring. Behind the horsehair chin pad of a giant French fencing mask waited a thin double wall, unopened for decades, holding what remained of another life. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Ines Marlow had been weaving her whole life without knowing it. As a child in Chalmette, she crossed loose threads whenever her mother mended hems at the kitchen table, making tiny lattices between her fingers until the cotton tightened into order. Their house stood close enough to the refinery that certain mornings carried a metallic sweetness through the screens. Ines learned early that broken things did not become whole through wishing. Someone had to sit beside them. Her mother, Celia, worked nights in a hotel laundry and slept with one hand curled beneath her cheek. She loved through packed lunches, clean collars, and exact bus fare laid beside the sugar bowl. Yet whenever trouble entered the room, Celia became still, as though silence might pass for neutrality. The person who taught Ines to use her hands without apology was her grandfather, Lucien Marlow. He repaired brass instruments in a narrow shed behind his house, where every shelf held jars of screws sorted by thread and length. On Saturdays, Ines arrived before 9 carrying 2 biscuits wrapped in wax paper. Lucien let her polish cornet valves, straighten bent key rods, and listen for leaks by turning each instrument slowly beneath a hanging lamp. When the work was done, he opened an old wooden case containing unfamiliar tools. Duckbill pliers, curved awls, a leather palm, and steel mandrels darkened by use. They had belonged to his own grandfather, who had once repaired fencing masks and protective gloves near the French Quarter. Lucien never explained why the tools remained hidden. He only placed them in her hands and showed her how wire remembered every careless bend. Protection must leave a person able to see, he told her. Otherwise, it is only another kind of prison. At 12, she understood the sentence as advice about masks. Years later, she understood that he had been speaking about fear. Lucien died during a humid August when Ines was 19. By the time she reached his house, distant relatives had emptied the shed. The brass instruments went to an auction company. The wooden case, the dark mandrels, and his notebooks disappeared with them. All Ines recovered was the canvas tool roll beneath his bench, overlooked because it smelled of oil and mildew. She kept it through every rented room afterward. By 25, she was inspecting invoices for a restoration supplier on Chupatula Street. The company failed quietly. First, the owner stopped replacing fluorescent tubes. Then, payroll arrived 4 days late, then 11. On February 3, 2022, the doors were chained before sunrise, leaving Ines owed 5 weeks of wages. Her landlord, Vernon Pike, managed the boarding house from a room behind the front parlor. He wore narrow suspenders and kept every payment date in a red ledger. His control was never loud. It appeared in missing mail he'd turned down after midnight, and notices slipped beneath doors while tenants were working. When Ines asked for 10 days, he examined the frayed cuff of her sweater instead of her face. "You have until Friday," he said, closing the ledger. On Thursday afternoon, she walked to a warehouse interview in freezing rain. When she returned, the brass key stopped halfway into the lock. A new silver cylinder shone beneath the porch light. Her suitcase sat behind the glass door, close enough to touch but beyond the reach of her hand. Vernon stood inside holding Lucien's canvas roll between 2 fingers. Beside him was Celia, summoned without warning. Her mother's hotel uniform was still damp at the shoulders. She looked at the suitcase, then at the floor. Vernon opened the door only as far as the security chain allowed and pushed the tool roll through the gap. "Your room is gone. Take nothing. Leave now." Exactly 8 words. Ines waited for her mother to speak. Celia pressed her lips together and folded her hands over her laundry badge. She did not meet her daughter's eyes. Vernon shut the door, and the new lock clicked with the clean finality of a drawer closing. The rain hardened into sleet. For 6 weeks, Ines moved through the city according to which spaces stayed unlocked. She spent 4 nights upright in the 24-hour terminal on Loyola Avenue until a guard began recognizing her. She slept beneath a stairwell near the Algiers ferry landing, where the river wind entered through every seam in her clothes. In Metairie, she hid behind stacked pallets at a garden center and woke with a snail attached to the canvas roll. Her $8 became $7 after a bus ride, then $5.60 after bread and peanut butter from a discount market. She walked towards Gretna because a church served soup on Wednesdays, but the intake line closed before she arrived. One night, she slept inside an abandoned laundry room in Arabi, curled beside a dead dryer that still held the faint warmth of the afternoon sun. She washed in public restrooms and dried her socks beneath hand blowers. She filled out applications at cafes, warehouses, hotels, and 2 preservation companies that were no longer hiring. By the first week of March, her money had fallen to $2.19. She kept the $8 bill intact only in memory. 4 ones spent, coins counted twice, every choice reducing the distance she could travel. The canvas roll remained tied beneath her shirt. On March 17th, she entered the main branch of the New Orleans Public Library to escape a cold front blowing off the river. Her shoes left gray crescents on the tile. She intended to use the employment computers, but every station was occupied, so she took a chair beside a corkboard layered with tax notices, room advertisements, and parish auction sheets. One paper had been pinned upside down. Ines turned it carefully. Abandoned structure, transformer dueling equipment workroom, and Loft $8. Deed fee included buyer assumes all repairs. The photograph showed a brick building scarcely wider than a shotgun house, with a sagging balcony and a faded oval sign above the door. Through the dirt on the sign, she could make out a wire mask crossed by 2 narrow blades. At the bottom, someone had written in blue ink, "Final offering before demolition review." Ines read the notice 3 times, then she opened Lucien's tool roll on her lap. The duckbill pliers were gone, as were the mandrels and awls, but his smallest brass ruler remained tucked inside a stitched pocket she had never noticed. One edge was engraved with a name, Marlow Mask Guard Works. The parish office closed at 4:30. It was already 3:10 and the property lay beyond the last bus stop she could afford to reach. Ines folded the auction sheet into quarters, returned the ruler to its pocket, and spent her final $2 on passage across the city. She did not know whether the loft had belonged to her family. She only knew someone had tried to erase it cheaply. By sunset, Ines was walking toward an $8 door with no key, no bed, and one inherited tool pointing the way. The bus carried Ines east beneath a sky the color of unpolished pewter, past drainage canals, repair yards, and neighborhoods where blue tarps still covered roofs from storms long gone. She rode to the end of the line, then walked 9 miles with the canvas roll tied beneath her sweater and the folded auction notice softening in her pocket. By dusk, the cold had sharpened to 34 degrees. She found an open hay barn beyond a parish road and slept between 2 square bales, using loose straw beneath her hips and the tool roll as a pillow. Rain tapped the metal roof after midnight. Each time the wind moved through the gaps in the siding, the dry stalks whispered around her like paper being turned. She rose before daylight and walked the remaining 4 miles toward a narrow settlement along the old river road. The place was called St. Armand, though it had never grown large enough to appear in most guidebooks. Its business district occupied 1 damp block, Boudreaux Hardware beneath a striped awning, Mercy Cafe with steamed windows, Landry's Pharmacy, Gulf Star Laundry, and a funeral home whose white columns leaned slightly toward the street. At 10 minutes past 8, Ines entered the parish clerk's satellite office. The room smelled of carbon paper, floor wax, and wet wool. Behind the counter sat a woman with one silver eyebrow that rose higher than the other whenever she read. Her nameplate said Mrs. Evelyn Russell, records clerk. Ines placed the auction notice on the counter, followed by 8 $1 bills. Mrs. Russell did not touch the money. "You understand the building has no active water service. Yes, ma'am. You understand the electrical connection was removed after the condemnation. Yes, ma'am. You understand the rear roof is open and the balcony has failed inspection. Yes, ma'am. You understand the parish will not reimburse you if the structure cannot be saved. Yes, ma'am. Mrs. Russell lowered the silver eyebrow. Most people interrupt before the fourth warning. I have nowhere else to interrupt from. For the first time, the clerk looked directly at her. Her gaze moved over Inez's damp sleeves, the mud whitening along her shoes, and the canvas roll held close against her ribs. She drew a deed form from a gray cabinet and turned it around. The property description ran through 2 lots, an alley easement, and a workroom designation retained from an ordinance written before the First World War. Ines signed where the clerk placed a wooden ruler, Mrs. Russell pressed the deed beneath a brass hand stamp. The mechanism came down with a heavy, deliberate clap, leaving the parish seal raised in the paper. Follow St. Claude Avenue until it meets the Old River Road, she said. Turn beside the brick pumping station. You will pass a cemetery wall, then a cane field. At the fork, keep left on Armand Lane. The loft stands behind the 3rd row of walnut trees. She reached for the $8, paused, and looked again at the signature. Marlow. Ines rested one hand on the counter. Mrs. Russell stood and opened a ledger stored beneath her desk. Its binding had been repaired with black cloth tape. She traced a column with one short fingernail. There was a Lucien Marlow who came here in 1987 asking about this place. He requested copies of the old trade licenses and the succession papers, paid for them in coins, all exact. He was my grandfather. The clerk sat down slowly. He said his family had made protective equipment before his father was born, masks, gloves, jackets. He believed the original workshop had been divided after a flood and sold under another name. She turned 3 brittle pages. This loft was registered to Etienne Marlow in 1891. The spelling changes in later records, but the trademark does not. From the ledger, she lifted a thin photocopy. At its center was an oval emblem, a fencing mask crossed by 2 narrow foils. The same design appeared on Lucien's ruler. Mrs. Russell slid the photocopy beneath the deed. Your grandfather came back twice. The last time he asked whether the building could be purchased. Why did he not buy it? The estate could not be cleared. There were missing heirs, unpaid assessments, and one signature no one could obtain. She closed the ledger. By the time the parish resolved it, his letters had stopped. Ines looked through the front window. Rainwater trembled in the branches of a leafless crepe myrtle. He never told me he found it. Some people wait until they can offer certainty. Mrs. Russell folded the deed into a yellow envelope. Sometimes certainty outlives them. Outside, the temperature had risen only 2 degrees. Ines followed St. Claude past warehouses and vacant lots, then turned where the clerk had instructed. The old road ran close to the Mississippi levee, its pavement broken by the roots of live oaks. A man repairing shrimp nets beside a cinder-block house watched her pass without speaking. His brown dog followed Ines for half a mile, stopping whenever she stopped, until the man gave one low whistle. Beyond the cemetery wall stood the walnut trees. Their trunks formed 3 uneven rows around a brick structure with a deep, narrow front. The loft measured perhaps 22 feet across and 50 feet from the street to the rear wall. Its lower story was made of rose-colored brick darkened by damp. Above it, weathered cypress boards enclosed the work loft beneath a steep slate roof. The rear slope had lost enough slates to expose the rafters. A single chimney rose along the eastern wall, its top listing toward the river. The iron balcony had pulled loose at one corner and hung over the entrance like a bent tray. Above the door remained the oval sign from the auction photograph. Marlow Mask Guard Works. Several letters had peeled away, but the wire mask at the center still showed 2 empty eye spaces. The front door resisted until Ines put her shoulder against it. When it opened, stale air pushed outward, carrying mildew, spoiled leather, copper rust, and the bitter dust of old coal. Something small moved inside the wall. She heard claws, then silence. The front room had once received customers. A long walnut counter leaned beneath a row of hooks, and rain had stained the plaster in the shape of branching rivers. Beneath her shoes, grit moved over the floorboards, She touched the wall and felt cold moisture against her fingertips. The back room was darker. Rolls of steel wire had collapsed against one another, their broken ends catching her sleeves. Flattened fencing masks hung from wooden pegs, each one dented inward where a face should have been. Their mesh was furred with green corrosion. Along one bench lay strips of leather so decayed that they separated when she lifted them. A sour taste gathered at the back of her throat. Yet beneath the ruin, the room had an order. Pliers had been outlined on the wall in faded pencil. Grooves worn into the workbench marked where wire had been bent against the same edge for years. On the floor she found a small crescent of horsehair padding, still bound with linen thread. She climbed the narrow stairs to the loft, testing each tread before trusting her weight. The upper room smelled of rain and pigeon feathers. Through the opening in the roof she could see a pale strip of evening sky. Water struck a metal basin someone had left beneath the gap, one slow drop at a time. Ines chose the driest corner. She swept aside plaster with a broken board, spread flattened cardboard beneath herself, and placed the yellow deed envelope inside her sweater. Her first meal in the building was half a biscuit saved from the church kitchen and water drawn from an outdoor tap at the neighboring cemetery. Night settled early. Wind entered through the roof and moved across the loft floor. Somewhere below, a hanging mask shifted on its peg, making a light metallic scrape. Ines lay awake listening until she understood that the building was not quiet at all. It spoke in slate, wire, timber, and rain, each material declaring the exact place where it had failed. She reached into the canvas roll and closed her fingers around Lucien's engraved ruler. The finest protection did not hide the eyes from darkness. It let them face the point of hardship without stepping back. For the first 3 days, Ines worked only on what would keep her alive. The well behind the walnut tree still held water, though its iron pump groaned before giving a brown first gush. She filled 2 enamel buckets, let the sediment settle, and boiled each pot over a borrowed camp stove. The outhouse leaned in toward the cane field but remained sound beneath its roof. Inside the loft, she learned which floorboards complained, which stair tread shifted, and where to place her weight when carrying water through darkness. On the 4th morning, she walked back to St. Armand with Lucien's ruler in her pocket. Boudreaux hardware was deeper than it appeared from the street. The air smelled of rope fiber, fertilizer, and machine oil. Glass jars of screws stood behind the counter beside seed packets faded nearly white. A gray-haired man with one missing fingertip was cutting keys beneath a green metal lamp. He glanced at the ruler when Ines set it down. Old trade piece, he said. My grandfather's. The man switched off the key machine. Armand Boudreaux, Ines Marlow. His eyes moved to her shoes, then to the list she had written on the back of the auction notice. You bought the mask loft for $8. That was the inexpensive part. She did not disagree. Ines asked whether she could open an account and pay after finding work. Armand rubbed the blunt end of his missing finger against the counter, considering the question. I do not extend credit to strangers. I understand. I extend small credit to buildings I would rather not see torn down. He pulled a narrow ledger from beneath the register and wrote her name on the first blank line. $10 at a time, he said. You pay something every Saturday, even if it is a quarter. Yes, sir. He added a used paperback manual titled Repairs for the Owner-Built House. Its cover had been taped twice. No charge for that. The roof chapter lies in 2 places, but the chimney chapter is honest. She bought a chimney brush for $4.75, 40 feet of rope for $2.20, a steel scraper for $1.10, a packet of dust masks for 90 cents, and 6 fire bricks at 35 cents each. Armand wrote the total in his ledger without asking for payment. Back at the loft, Ines opened every window that would move and tied a damp cloth across the doorway between the workroom and the stairs. The chimney had no clean-out door, so she removed 3 loose bricks near its base and set them aside in order. She tied the round brush to the rope, climbed onto the lower roof, and fed it down the flue in short strokes. The first pull brought little. The second released a black sheet of creosote that struck the hearth below like dried earth. She worked the brush upward and downward, rotating it where the flue narrowed, until her palms burned through the borrowed gloves. Twice the rope snagged. The second time, she lay flat across the damp slate and worked it loose by inches while wind lifted the back of her coat. After 6 hours, the soot pile reached halfway to her knee. She crawled inside the hearth with the steel scraper and removed glazed deposits from the smoke shelf, then passed a small mirror through the opening to check the light above. A crooked ribbon of sky appeared at the top of the flue. By late afternoon, she had cleared the obstruction and replaced the loose bricks without mortar, leaving repair for another day. The first fire was no larger than both her hands. She twisted newspaper beneath cedar splinters, added 2 pieces of dry walnut, and held her breath as the flame climbed. Smoke hesitated beneath the lintel, then drew upward in a clean blue thread. Ines sat on the floor until the room warmed. Her first hot meal in the loft was rice cooked with half an onion and a spoonful of beans from Mercy Cafe. She ate from the pot beside the hearth, watching steam gather on the spoon. Outside, rain touched the walnut branches. Inside, the masks no longer looked like faces hanging in darkness. They looked like work waiting for hands. The next morning, she began the inventory. She chose only what had survived with purpose: 3 duckbill pliers browned with surface rust, a wire gauge plate stamped in millimeters, 2 curved awls with horn handles, a wooden head form split along one temple, a leather worker's palm hardened by sweat, a bundle of drawn steel wire wrapped in oilcloth, and a French pattern mask larger than any other in the room. The mask stood nearly 2 feet high. Its black mesh remained intact, though the leather rim had curled away from the steel. A thick chin pad protruded inside, stuffed with horsehair and covered by 2 layers of dark hide. She lifted it from the shelf. The weight pulled unexpectedly against her wrist. Ines set it on the walnut counter and tapped the frame with Lucien's ruler. The crown returned a bright metallic note. The left cheek sounded duller. At the chin, the ruler produced no ring at all. She removed the leather rim stitch by stitch, sliding the curved awl beneath linen thread without cutting it. The horsehair pad came free as a single crescent, dense with dust but not decay. Behind it lay a cedar disc no wider than her palm, fitted flush inside the lower frame. There was no reason for cedar to be there. She pressed it with her thumb. It did not move. From the canvas roll, she took Lucien's smallest screwdriver, worked the blade into a shallow notch, and turned. The disc rotated 1/4 turn and released. A dry breath of air passed from the opening. Inside the hollow chin frame were 3 packages bound in waxed cloth. Ines carried them to the front room and placed them beside the hearth. She did not tear the wrappings. She warmed her fingers first, then loosened each knot with the awl. The first bundle held tools: 2 fine-nosed mesh pliers polished bright beneath their grease, a pair of wire-cutting nippers, 6 steel mandrels, and a silver thimble engraved with the Marlow trademark. The second contained flattened coils of dark wire, a small book sewn in sealskin, and a miniature fencing mask cast in silver, no longer than the first joint of her thumb. Its mesh openings were individually pierced. The third package was a rectangular tin box wrapped twice in oiled linen. Ines tested its weight in both hands. Something shifted inside with the close, heavy sound of coins. Beneath the box lay an envelope bearing no address, only a line written in brown ink: "For the one who opens the mask carefully." She placed the envelope against the hearthstone and left it sealed. The tin box opened with pressure from the screwdriver. Inside were paper packets, cloth rolls, and a small leather pouch. The paper money had been folded around thin pieces of cedar to keep it flat. Some notes were old enough that their borders had softened. Others came from later decades and had been added in separate envelopes bearing dates. Ines counted everything on the counter. She counted once with the silver mask beside her, then again using Lucien's ruler to hold each column straight. The total was $35,900. There were $20 Liberty gold pieces, $10 Indian head coins, Morgan silver dollars, and smaller Barber half-dollars blackened along their edges. Beneath them lay a purple heart in a worn presentation case. The paper label inside had faded, but the year remained legible. 1944. The money did not resemble wealth. It resembled time pressed into metal decade after decade by people who had expected someone careful to come after them. In the sealskin book, the first pages held diagrams of mesh spacing and crown curvature. Later entries gave tempering temperatures, wire gauges, and notes on how much visibility was lost when openings narrowed beyond a certain measure. Ines read only one page before closing it. Her hands had begun to tremble, and she did not want trembling hands touching anything older than herself. She returned the coins to their packets and the notes to their cedar boards. The metal remained in its case. She wrapped the silver mask in clean cloth and set it beside the unopened envelope. Night gathered around the walnut trees. Ines carried the tin box into the loft, then changed her mind and brought it back downstairs, placing it beneath the workbench where rain could not reach. She checked the front door twice, secured it with a length of wire, and sat before the cold hearth. The envelope waited on the stone. She could have opened it in one movement. Instead, she put on her shoes and stepped through the rear door. Beyond the outhouse, drainage water moved toward the river in a dark, narrow channel. The moon appeared between clouds, breaking into pieces across the surface. Ines stood there until her breathing matched the slow passage of the water. She had spent 6 weeks fearing every locked door. Now, one had opened from inside an old mask, and she was not yet ready to learn who had left the key. The finest protection did not hide the eyes from darkness. It let them face the point of hardship without stepping back. At first light, Ines returned from the drainage channel with mud dried along the edges of her shoes. She heated water, washed her hands, and sat on the hearthstone. The envelope had browned unevenly around the seal. When she turned it over, the slant of the capital M stopped her. Lucien had written grocery lists in that same careful hand. She opened the envelope with the curved awl, "My dear one, whoever you are. If you have found this letter, you removed the chin pad without tearing the linen stitches. That tells me more about you than a name could. I am Lucien and Marlow, writing in New Orleans under the care of Dr. Miriam Cates at Charity Hospital. She has told me the cancer in my pancreas has moved beyond treatment. I have perhaps 3 months, though doctors speak of time more cautiously than craftsmen do. Our work began with Etienne Marlow, born in Nantes in 1848, who came to New Orleans in 1870 and opened a wire workshop near Exchange Alley. His daughter Amélie, born here in 1878, learned the mesh table and kept the shop after the hurricane of 1915. Her son Henri, born in 1901, moved the work to Saint Armand after the river warehouse flooded in 1927. Henri's son Marcel, my father, returned from France in 1945 without his younger brother Joseph, who was killed while serving with the United States Army during the Second World War. The trade closed on November 6, 1963. My father locked the door after the final order and never entered again. He believed Joseph's death had made the work useless. For more than 30 years, this building remained silent while the family argued over taxes, names, and ownership. I located it too late to repair what had been neglected, but not too late to leave the knowledge where a patient person might find it. The mesh formula is in the sealskin book. Use low-carbon drawn steel at 19 gauge for practice and 17 gauge for a finished guard. Heat test samples to 760 degrees Fahrenheit. Then cool them in still air rather than water. Keep the crown openings near 3 millimeters, widening toward 4 at the cheeks so the eyes do not tire. For the rim, soak oak tanned hide for 18 minutes, then bend it damp around the frame. The horsehair pad should be 2 parts tail hair to 1 part wool, packed loosely enough to recover after pressure. Do not trust wire merely because it looks strong. Strike every finished crown 3 times with a blunted test point and inspect the crossings under a lamp. The money was saved in uneven years. Some came from repairs, some from the sale of instruments, and some from what remained after my mother died. It is not payment for carrying our name. It is time enough to learn without hunger deciding every choice. Inheritance is not possession. It is the moment one pair of hands completes a task another pair could not finish. Behind the loft, beneath the eastern walnut, there is a small iron marker set level with the ground. Joseph's initials are stamped beneath the rust. If it remains, clean it, but do not move it. He never came home, and my father needed one place where he could speak to him. Keep the silver mask. It was made by Amélie when she was 11. Spend the money slowly. Learn the work more slowly still. You owe the dead no imitation, only attention. The house is not empty. It has been waiting. You are welcome here. Lucien and Amélie Marlow. October 12, 1996. Ines read the letter twice. The second time, she paused where Lucien had written that hunger should not decide every choice. Then she folded the pages along their original creases, pressing each line flat with the side of her thumb. She placed the letter inside its envelope and rested both hands upon it until the firewood settled with a quiet crack. Through the back door, the ground remained wet from the night rain. Ines walked to the eastern walnut carrying the steel scraper and a rag. Fallen leaves had gathered around the roots in a dark ring. She searched near the trunk, moving slowly so the tool would not strike stone. The scraper touched iron 6 inches beneath the leaves. She cleared a rectangle no larger than a book. Rust covered most of its surface, but beneath a shallow arch she found the letters J.M. and the number 1944. One corner had sunk into the soil. She did not lift it. She wiped the metal with the rag until the initials held a little morning light. Back inside, she opened the first bundle of tools and removed Lucien's silver thimble. It was too narrow for her finger. She cleaned its inner rim with cloth, set it upright on the hearth, and placed a short candle inside it. The flame rose through the opening where a needle had once passed. Its light reached the tin box, the sealskin manual, and the miniature mask. It also reached the ordinary things that had carried her this far. The taped repair book from Armand Boudreau, the biscuit paper saved from the church kitchen, and the yellow deed envelope stamped by Mrs. Roussel. She remembered the bus driver who had waited while she counted damp coins, the woman at Mercy Cafe who had slipped beans beneath her rice without adding them to the price, the cemetery groundskeeper who had left the outdoor tap unlocked after seeing her buckets, Armand, who had written $10 beneath her name and treated the building as a reason to trust her. None of them had rescued her. Each had simply refused to make one hard hour harder. There may have been a small kindness like that in your own life. A meal placed quietly nearby, a door held open. A stranger who believed your word when it would have been easier not to. What was it, and whose hands carried it to you? Ines trimmed the candlewick and returned Lucien's letter to the tin box. She wrapped the metal in clean linen, set the silver mask beside it, and carried the heirloom tools upstairs one bundle at a time. That night, she slept on the cardboard with the canvas roll beneath her head and the recovered tools aligned beside her shoulder. Wind passed through the broken roof, but she no longer listened for the building to reject her. She listened for the work it had kept. The first snow came on December 2nd, 3 inches driven sideways through the opening above the rear rafters. Ines woke with white powder across the cardboard near her feet and spent the morning carrying buckets upstairs to catch the melt. She read the roofing chapter 3 times before climbing outside. The loft roof measured 22 feet by 50, though only the rear third required immediate replacement. She calculated 12 squares of salvaged slate and asphalt shingles combined, 4 rolls of felt, and nearly 20 pounds of galvanized nails. Armand checked her figures without changing them, then reached beneath his counter and produced a roofing hatchet with a square head and a worn leather grip. "My brother used this," he said. "Keep the edge dry." An elderly man named Ellis Duval arrived the following morning in a canvas coat polished smooth at the elbows. He had roofed houses for 42 years and walked with one knee that refused to bend fully. "I cannot pay you," Ines told him. "Then do not waste my time arguing." They worked for 11 days. Ellis showed her how to brace the weakened rafter with a sister rafter bolted alongside it, how to snap a chalk line without smearing blue dust across wet felt, and how to drive each nail with 3 strokes. Set, seat, finish. That nail's proud. Ines lowered the hatchet. "Pull it." She did. By the 4th day, her shoulders burned before noon. By the 7th, she could judge slate overlap by sight. Ellis spoke little, but each afternoon he left one exact correction behind. On December 14th, they fixed the final ridge piece beneath a pale, windless sky. Rain came that night. Ines climbed to the loft with a lantern and waited beneath the repaired section. Nothing fell. Cold entered hard in January. Powdered mortar gathered beneath the chimney each morning, and several outer bricks had begun to spall, their faces lifting away in thin red shells. Ines removed only what moved beneath light pressure. She numbered the sound bricks in chalk and rebuilt the damaged courses with hydraulic lime, mixed 3 parts to 1 part fine sand. Around the firebox, she added 1 measure of fire clay to 3 measures of lime mortar, enough to endure heat without making the joint too rigid. The work lasted 3 weeks in temperatures that rarely climbed above the 20s. She mixed mortar in a shallow pan, dampened each brick before setting it, and packed the joints with a narrow, pointing trowel. Every 15 minutes her bare fingers went numb. Gloves dulled her sense of pressure, so she warmed her hands over a jar of hot water, then returned to the wall before the mortar skinned over. One morning, a joint cracked because she had allowed the brick to dry too quickly. She removed it and began again. On January 27th, she lit a test fire using cedar, then walnut. The flame rose steadily. Smoke passed the lintel without folding into the room, and outside a clean gray thread lifted above the chimney toward the river. Ines stood in the yard until the smoke disappeared. Beneath the soot and water stains, the ground floor was laid in white pine planks fastened with hand-cut rosehead nails. Ines drove each loose nail below the surface with a square punch, then rented a random orbit sander from Armand for $14 a day. She began with 80 grit, moving along the grain in slow overlapping passes. The second pass at 120 removed the circular marks left by hesitation. The final pass at 220 softened the surface without erasing the shallow grooves made by generations of boots. Dust entered everything. It settled inside her sleeves, along her hairline, and beneath the hinges of the miniature silver mask. She vacuumed twice, wiped the boards with mineral spirits, and laid down the first oil coat using a folded cotton rag. The pine darkened from tired gray to deep honey. A second coat brought warmer red beneath the grain. After the third, the boards held the color of old mahogany where afternoon light crossed them. She blocked the doors and allowed 48 hours for the finish to cure. There was one bad morning before the second coat. Ines carried the oil can to the back room, set it down unopened, and walked to the marsh. A great blue heron stood in the shallows, motionless except for the feathers along its neck. She watched it for more than an hour. Then she returned to the loft and did no work for the rest of the day. The boards waited without complaint. The building had 8 windows, 3 had no glass, 4 held cracked panes repaired with tape or paper. The last contained 1 original sheet from 1788, its surface wavering with small, trapped bubbles. Ines preserved that pane exactly where it was. For the others, she removed brittle putty with a warmed knife, cleaned the glazing rabbets, and pressed fresh Dieppe 33 beneath each replacement pane. She set the glass against the bed, fixed it with small glazing points, then drew the putty knife along the edge in one continuous angle so the exterior bevel shed rain. Several sash cords had rotted through. She replaced them with a 1/4-inch cotton cord, feeding each length over the pulley and tying a figure-8 knot at the counterweight before lowering it into the pocket. The first repaired sash dropped too fast and struck the sill. Ines reopened the weight box, shortened the cord by 1/2 inch, and tried again. This time the window remained wherever she placed it. On the last afternoon of February, she reset the final pane while sunlight moved across the walnut trees. As she smoothed the lower putty line, a chickadee landed on a bare branch outside. The bird tilted its black-capped head towards the glass. Ines held still with the knife raised. For several seconds, the old pane placed them in the same wavering light. The worst wall stood beside the chimney, where moisture had loosened the old horsehair plaster from hand-split oak lath. Ines tried 3 small patches and watched each one fail differently. The first sagged before evening. The second cracked around its edges. The third dried too quickly and released from the lath with a hollow tap. Armand found an old burlap bag in his storage room, filled with horsehair saved by his father from an upholstery job. Ines washed the fibers, cut them into short lengths, and mixed them through lime plaster until the mass held together when lifted on the hawk. She pressed a scored scratch coat between the lath strips, leaving rough horizontal lines for grip. Over that came a 3/8-inch brown coat, kept damp beneath cloth for 72 hours. The finished coat was 1/8 inch, thin enough to follow the wall rather than disguise it. When the last patch set firm beside the repaired brick, Ines passed her palm across its uneven surface. These patches will hold another 100 years. Doris Bell, who owned Mercy Cafe, had red spectacles that slipped down her nose whenever she lied about having made too much food. Twice a week, paper bags appeared on the Loft's doorstep containing cornbread, boiled eggs, or a jar of chicken stew. When Ines carried the empty jars back, Doris pushed them beneath the counter. "You may pay me in candles when the shop reopens." She said it as though reopening were an ordinary date already written on the calendar. Caleb Thibodeau arrived one Saturday on a blue Schwinn bicycle, a splitting maul balanced across the handlebars. He was 16, narrow as a sapling, with one front tooth chipped at the corner. Without asking permission, he began breaking storm-fallen walnut limbs into stove lengths. Ines offered him $2. He shook his head and kept stacking wood. My mother said, "About your grandfather, that was all." The following week he returned with wedges Reverend Boyd walked past each morning on his way to a small white church near the cemetery. He wore a straw hat in every season and carried no umbrella even in rain. He never entered the loft. He only tipped his hat toward whichever window held Ines. One morning, while she stood on the balcony resetting an iron brace, he paused beneath the walnut tree. "May your hands stay steady." Then he continued down the road, leaving 4 words behind him. Ines postponed the cellar until February 11th. The entrance lay beneath a warped hatch behind the workbench. 7 granite steps descended into a room measuring 12 by 15 feet. Its floor made from irregular fieldstone fitted close enough to resist weeds. The air smelled of limestone, damp oak, and something faintly sweet that might once have been lamp oil. At the center of the floor lay a dressed granite slab. A craft mark had been carved into its surface, the oval fencing mask crossed by 2 foils. Ines swept around it but did not attempt to lift it. Under the 3rd stair, her fingers touched a small oak box wedged between the stringer and the wall. The lid had swollen shut. She carried it upstairs, eased the seam apart with a putty knife, and found a brass key wrapped in linen. Its bow was shaped like the same oval mask. Beneath the key lay a tintype dated 1903. It showed a young woman standing outside the loft before the balcony had sagged. She held duckbill pliers in one hand and wore her hair pulled low at the nape. The face was Ines's face, not exactly. The mouth was firmer, the brows heavier, yet the resemblance was close enough that Ines lowered the photograph and looked toward the dark front window. On the back, in faded ink, someone had written Amélie Marlow, daughter of Etienne, age 25, summer of 1903. Ines placed the tintype beside the silver mask. The brass key remained on the mantel above the hearth. She did not know what it opened. By March, the snow had withdrawn into the shaded ditches. The creek behind the cane field grew loud with runoff, and pale green walnut catkins hung from the branches like soft cords. Ines cleaned the mesh table and repaired one bench, but she did not begin a full fencing mask that spring. The sealskin manual required more than eagerness. It required samples, failed joints, and hands trained to recognize the moment before wire weakened. She chose one barber $50 from the cash and spent it on practice steel, scrap leather, and a small bundle of horsehair. Each evening, she wove squares no larger than her palm, struck them with a blunted point, and recorded the bent crossings in Lucien's blank margins. The house was patient, so was she. 2 winters later, in December 2024, Ines completed her first full fencing mask. She had begun it in August with 17-gauge low-carbon steel, annealed in small batches and tested before weaving. The crown took 9 weeks. She shaped it across the repaired wooden head form, adjusting the openings from 3 millimeters at the center to 4 near the cheeks. The leather rim soaked for 18 minutes before she bent it around the frame and clamped it beneath linen tape. For the chin pad, she mixed 2 parts tail hair with 1 part wool and packed it loosely behind oak-tanned hide. Then she placed the finished mask beneath the hanging lamp and struck the crown 3 times with a blunted test point. The mesh flexed. It returned. She inspected every crossing and found none broken. The restored shop no longer resembled the condemned photograph. Light moved through clear windows onto the darkened pine floor. The chimney drew evenly. Plaster followed the old walls in gentle waves, and the walnut counter stood level again, marked by cuts Ines had chosen not to sand away. She kept Lucien's letter beneath glass inside the workroom, but the money and heirlooms remained hidden. The brass key stayed on the mantel for nearly another year. Its purpose became clear after a summer storm split a low branch from the eastern walnut. While trimming the brake, Caleb noticed a green oval beneath the bark near the trunk's northern side. It was not part of the tree. A brass plate had been set into a hollow long ago, then covered by decades of growth. The plate carried the Marlow craft mark. Ines brought the key from the mantel. Its teeth entered the lock without resistance. Behind the plate was a narrow copper cylinder sealed with wax. Inside lay a folded 48-star American flag, no larger than a handkerchief, and a note dated June 18, 1944. The writing belonged to Amélie Marlow. She had written during the weeks after the Allied landings in Normandy, while Joseph Marlow served with an Army engineering unit in France. The note did not speak of glory. It asked that the flag be given to him if he returned, and placed near his name if he did not. She wrote that Joseph had learned to temper wire at the same bench where she had worked as a girl, and that he disliked ceremonies but respected exact work. At the bottom, she added one sentence. A guard is worthy only when the person behind it can still recognize the world. Ines refolded the flag along its old lines. On November 11, 2025, she carried the Purple Heart and the small flag to Chalmette National Cemetery. Joseph had no graves there, but the superintendent helped locate a family memorial stone added after the war. Ines cleaned its lower edge and placed the metal against the carved name while the morning observance took place at a distance. She did not leave it exposed. Afterward, she sealed the metal and flag in an archival box and deposited them with the cemetery collection under Joseph's full record. No speech was given. A clerk signed the receipt, and Ines walked back to the bus beneath bare cypress branches. Of the cash, she used 4 coins. One purchased the practice materials. A second paid for the final slate needed at the chimney edge. The third covered a used foot-powered wire drawbench from a retiring jeweler in Baton Rouge. The fourth paid a conservator to stabilize Lucien's letter and Amélie's tintype. The paper money remained between its cedar boards. The remaining coins returned to the tin box with the sealskin manual and miniature silver mask. Ines wrapped the box in new oiled linen and placed it behind the repaired chin pad of the giant French mask. She added an envelope of her own. Across its front she wrote, "For the next one who opens this carefully." The shop reopened without an announcement. Doris pinned a white index card to the corkboard inside Mercy Cafe. Marlow Mask Guard Works wire repair, leather edging, historic reproductions inquiries by mail. For 3 weeks, no one wrote. Then a fencing club in Mobile asked whether Ines could repair a 19th century training mask. A museum in Natchez requested replacement leather for a display piece. A stage company mailed photographs of 2 crushed guards found in storage. By spring, more than 40 names filled a paper mailing list kept in Mrs. Russell's old ledger style. Ines accepted only the work she could complete carefully. No customer was promised speed. Caleb returned in June carrying a hand-carved cypress sign across the handlebars of a newer bicycle. He had grown broader through the shoulders, though the same chip remained in his front tooth. The sign read, Marlow Mask Guard. Works and daughter signs traced the final 2 words. "There are no daughters," she said. Caleb rested the sign against the counter. There were. He pointed toward Amélie's tintype, and there might be again. The addition was not polished as finely as the older lettering. 1 ampersand leaned slightly. Ines hung it above the workbench exactly as he had carved it. That autumn she began a letter on heavy cream paper. She used Lucien's opening because no other words seemed honest enough. "My dear one, whoever you are," she wrote about the loft as it now stood, about the roof measurements and the chimney mortar, about the window from 1788 that should never be replaced merely because it distorted the view. She listed the true costs of materials and explained which hardware account had first allowed her to work without cash. She did not instruct the future reader to preserve the business. Instead, she wrote that inherited work must remain a choice. The tools could be used, donated, or left untouched. The money could buy time, but it could not tell anyone what to become. Near the end, she described the night she had slept beneath the open roof while the masks moved downstairs. The finest protection did not hide the eyes from darkness. It let them face the point of hardship without stepping back. She signed her full name and left the date blank. Outside, the walnut leaves turned their pale undersides toward the river wind. Ines closed the workshop windows one by one, covered the mesh table, and checked the banked fire. The historic fencing mask maker's loft waits. It has always waited. Years later, Mrs. Russell retired from the parish office. While clearing her desk, she found one of Ines's original $8 bills beneath the drawer liner, set aside on the morning the deed was stamped. She placed it inside the old property ledger and wrote only one note in the margin, paid in full.